Hey friends, this is Joseph Maynor. So what I want to do in this video is I want to do my spiritual enlightenment number 7. Basically, there's 1 through 6 already done, so I want to do number 7. The reason why I want to do this video, because I think this is a great exercise in conscious creation, and I think I can kind of show you guys how this works kind of under the hood. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to list off all of the categories that I think are relevant. And then after looking at the categories that I've already done, right, in spiritual enlightenment 1 through 6, I'm basically going to create something new for spiritual enlightenment number 7. So this is a good video when it comes to these kinds of issues of artistry and creation. So without further ado, I don't want to put anything too much in your way, in terms of your experience of this, and you're going to make up your own mind, right, as to just let yourself feel and think about everything that I'm saying, and come up with your own intuitions about it. So first of all, let's just go over the topics that I want to discuss in this video. So it's a 30-minute video. It's going to be completely improvised. So the topics that I want to discuss are as follows: influences, the creator, originality, psychedelics, epistemology, specifically as a gatekeeper to truth with a capital T, will over emotions, morality about social relation, reactivity, why am I creating this, right, instead of something else, energy, vibe, humming along with an artwork, right? Notice this. Could be anyway. I don't want to provide too much commentary at this point. So, energy / vibe, humming along with an artwork, God versus human, judgment, fantasy versus accuracy, groupthink, standard of agreement, weaponizing, specifically truth, love, beauty, and wisdom, calmness, survival, magic, the mystic, imagination, the director. And so in this 7th part of spiritual enlightenment in my series, I've already done 6, and those have already had their own topics. I'm not going to read those off to you. I mean, you can watch those videos if you want to. But I've kind of consolidated this video down into 6 parts, just like I did on these other ones about spiritual enlightenment. So the first topic I want to discuss is the creator. The second topic is the path. The third topic is reactivity. The fourth topic is groupthink. The 5th topic is wisdom. And the 6th topic is practices. And so what I'm going to do basically is try to use the muses, so to speak, my own intuition, my own reactivity, to try to put together a video that fits the creator, the path, reactivity, groupthink, wisdom, practices, but also touches all these other topics that we just discussed. So that's the exercise, right? So I'm basically showing you guys how artistry works under the hood, how the sausage is made, right? No matter whether you're a chef, no matter whether you're I don't care what you do, right? It's the same kind of creative process. And one of the things that I'm gonna suggest to you guys over time is that this creative process is really fundamental also not just to spirituality, but also to self-help. So there's a great book by Fritz called The Path of Least Resistance, right? I'm going to discuss after we do our Clarity Jumpstart stuff, which I'm going to go through next week, the next aspect of that. So, but this issue of creativity is actually really profound, and not only does it touch spirituality, but it also touches self-help. Then there's a book by Rick Rubin called The Creative Act, right? So I think I like both of those books. I think that they're both imperfect, but, at least if I was to say that the bridge between spirituality and self-help, from my point of view, really lends itself to these two books as being really important. And actually, I think what I'm going to do over time is give kind of a review of these books too, just to show how important they are. So let's start with the creator. Well, first of all, realize that every creator has influences. No creator is entirely original. And notice that the creator operates in space and time too. The creator creates artworks in space and time. This is why I like to say that the ego exists, right? The finite perspectives exist because that's exactly what makes creation possible. As a creator, you wouldn't be able to create anything if there was no artworks to create. So, but also, what does the creator create from? Well, the creator creates from nothing, right? This is the paradox. The creator creates from nothing, and the creator has influences. So in other words, you're stepping into an art form, whether you realize it or not, even if you're a spiritual teacher. You're stepping into the art form of spiritual teachers. But what you're creating from ultimately is from nothing, pure originality. So the creative motive underneath is nothingness. But when it manifests as a creation, it's going to have a chain of influences. Just like a music album, right? Nobody creates a music album entirely unique. You can always trace a lineage of influences, right, to any kind of artwork that's created, including spirituality and spiritual teachers. So there's an aspect of magic or mysticism or the imagination, and also the director. Notice this, the creator is the director too. So in other words, you're directing your own play, whether you realize this or not, even as a finite perspective. You can become conscious of this. But it's not, the consciousness isn't always there that you're doing this, but it's something that you might create. You might create a consciousness of this. And so, but this gets to the issue of the path. So for example, there's a time and place for this kind of recognition. It may not happen early. It may happen later. It may not happen at all. Like, you may not create this realization, and that's good too. So I don't assume that everybody needs to consciously create the same way that I do. But what I'm kind of sharing is like, you do this for you, right? You may be a Christian, a Muslim, whatever, a scientist, an atheist. I mean, the point that I'm just kind of sharing with you guys some things that I feel like are important as a creator. And that might influence you to step outside of your comfort zone a little bit. I mean, and even comfort zone, because a lot of people's comfort zone is creation. So it might be stepping inside of your comfort zone too. I don't know, right? And but I'm very full aware that I'm just, basically consciously creating as a finite perspective here too. So don't take me too seriously. So the creator, the director, the mystic. Let's see here. I got to have a way sometimes of eliminating topics. So we've talked about that. And what is the best way to create, actually? It's when you're calm, isn't it? This is something that's really important too. It's really hard to create when you're not calm. You can still create, but creating when you're calm is it's enjoyable, isn't it? Right? When you're creating when you're calm. It's the inverse of stress or feeling like you're doing something for survival. But also you're creating to survive as well, aren't you? Like whatever you're doing to make money or to secure money, you're also creating that. So, and you're also creating any kind of you're also creating how you're weaponizing as well, right? So in other words, we talked about truth, love, beauty, and wisdom. So in other words, you can create to align with those. So for example, to align with truth, you can create you're false. Or to align with love, you can create you're disagreeable. Or to align with beauty, you can create you're ugly. Or to align with wisdom, you can create you're stupid. But ultimately, this is for survival, or else you wouldn't do this, right? But you're doing this because it's about marketing yourself, right? As a spiritual teacher, ultimately, to make money doing that as a career. So the path. Let's talk about that. So one of the things about the path that I think is really important is, first of all, let's talk about this issue of psychedelics. Psychedelics has been really tricky for me because I work a normal kind of a job. I'm a senior litigation paralegal, and I've been that way for 19 years now, right? So I definitely don't want to build a reputation for myself for being some kind of a psychedelic wacko loon kind of person. But I have done psychedelics, and I've done a lot of them years ago mostly. But I will say this about psychedelics. If you haven't done psychedelics, you shouldn't talk about psychedelics because you haven't done it, right? Don't talk about something you haven't done. Don't judge something you haven't done. But I will also say this about psychedelics. If you've done psychedelics, realize that you come down from the trip every time. And so if you're building conclusions from the peak of the trips that you're having, you're already wrong. Because those insights, most of the time, happen when you're coming down from the trip, right? They're not happening at the peak phase of the trip. And also, the peak phase of a trip isn't your whole life. It's just a moment in time. So whatever spirituality you develop, it can't be based on just your interpretation of the peak phase of your trips. Oftentimes to impress other people too, like, oh yeah, like I've had all these insights. You're not doing that for you. You're doing that to impress other people too. So notice that, right? Notice that groupthink aspect of that. Okay. So psychedelics are a little bit tricky. I'm not a psychonaut, but I've done psychedelics and I really, honestly, from a perspectival standpoint, they were beneficial to my path. Okay. The next thing is reactivity. Now, there's a kind of a theory in spiritual enlightenment that reactivity is bad. Like, reactivity is about ego. It's about misalignment in some way. Like, why am I creating this? Why am I creating this conflict? And there is something true there. You'll learn this over time. Like, as you gain wisdom, you'll realize that there's a signal. Like, you'll learn how to trust your reactivity, actually. This is actually kind of counterintuitive, because you're taught in spirituality that oh, you gotta, mind over matter, will over emotions. But the thing is that your emotions are actually cognitions. Your emotions are giving you information. And you might ask yourself, well, why am I creating all these things that have caused all these adverse conditions to my life? Don't think about it that way. Like, have no regrets, right? You can't change the past anyway. So there's no point in having any kind of regrets about any of this. But this doesn't mean that you need to become like a stoic or something like that, right? Your reactivity is your character, actually. It's what makes you you. The energy, the vibe that you give off as a human, right? And that oftentimes in spirituality, the human is seen as something that must be overcome, right? So this is the God versus human dichotomy. So friends, we're halfway through the video, a little bit over halfway. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a break. I'll come back and we'll do the second half. So just give me 1 second. Hey friends, welcome back. So you can see what I'm doing here is I'm trusting my own intuition to create an artwork in this video. This is exactly what conscious creation is. Now, I'm not saying that your intuition is always perfect. I mean, this is why it's important this is why the path is important. This is why it's important to spend a lot of time in some area that you want to basically be competent in talking about. And in my case, I've spent since 2014, I've basically been doing this work pretty heavily, right? So that's, 10 years plus. But that credibility shouldn't matter to you. Like, Eddie Van Halen doesn't talk about how much competency he has in playing guitar. It's whatever sounds good to you ultimately is good. See? So my character, I don't need to justify my character. You don't need to justify your character, right? You can, as you go along the path, you can learn how to modify how you direct your creation. But ultimately, I think going through life with a whole bunch of regrets and guilt is not the way to do it. And also, when we talk about God versus human, I don't look at it like God is a non-religious God necessarily. God is whatever you create it to be. So this is why I don't see that somehow spiritual enlightenment should be kind of weighed over or levied over other people, right? That's not the right kind of attitude to have, because what you're saying is you're telling other people that they're false. I don't see that as helpful, right? Because I'm very conscious of the fact that the God versus human duality has a wobble to it. Or you might say the infinite versus finite has a wobble. It's not a clear, bright line, dualistic slice there. So epistemology being the gatekeeper to truth, I think that's a groupthink thing. That ultimately is about groupthink. Because if you have truth, you don't need epistemology. Epistemology is about trying to convince somebody else or trying to help somebody else ultimately. I mean, epistemology may or may not be relevant for you to discover absolute truth. You may just discover absolute truth without epistemology. So how about morality? Well, I mean, ultimately, again, this gets back to this God versus human dichotomy, this idea that, well, the human is somehow seen as something that must be overcome. Very Nietzschean in a way. And very postmodern in a way, too, like we got to deconstruct the human. Very skeptical, very scientific almost. Kind of goes against a certain way, like, I would say like emotions, energy, vibe, those kinds of things. Like it's an attempt to try to overcome something. And you want to ask yourself, like, why do you need to overcome something? Like, did something happen to you in the human that just caused you to hate the human in some way, and now you're trying to cope, or you're trying to self-soothe yourself by going beyond the human? I'm not saying that's true, but it's something to kind of keep in mind. So groupthink is not going to give you absolute truth. It could give you agreeableness, right? So love, in a way, is kind of about agreeableness. One of the insults that you can give somebody about absolute love is you're disagreeable, right? Well, but that gets into morality too. Like, is it wrong to be disagreeable towards somebody who wants to hurt you, or wants to embarrass you, or wants to shame you? In a moment in time, maybe not ultimately, maybe not like forever, because all of this stuff happens in space and time. So I feel like there's this, again, going back to this God versus human dichotomy, there's this assumption that it never happened, right? Or that space and time doesn't exist. But then we talk about the path too. So it's like, it's in a way kind of a conflict between dualism and monism. But there are different kinds of monism. So there's qualitative monism and there's quantitative monism. So in other words, you could be a quantitative monist, but a qualitative dualist. This is kind of what Advaita Vedanta is under Shankara. In other words, Shankara would say, ultimately, there's only one thing, but practically, it's best to think that there's two things, namely the absolute and the relative, right? So I'm thinking a lot of people are missing that sort of, you can be a quantitative monist and a qualitative dualist. So, let's see here. So groupthink is deeper than most people think. I mean, if you're talking to somebody else, that's already groupthink, right? So, one of the things I noticed is sometimes I really have to get away from groups and just go off on my own. And I'll spend the whole day meditating, or like, in here. And what I've kind of learned when I step away from the group is that my consciousness is always filled with something, right? It's filled with some kind of issue or problem or else it's not filled with anything. Like I'm just sitting here like totally blank, just like, and that's fine too. So you become very aware of the difference between consciousness and being engaged in some kind of a thing. And usually being engaged in some kind of a thing is a form of groupthink. I'm not saying that's bad, but it's just something to kind of be aware of. And it's really your own judgment, which includes your reactivity, that matters. Okay, so let's look at this issue of fantasy versus accuracy. Well, I don't think most people really have a clue as to this distinction in their own life. And I don't think they need to. Just like you don't really need to have a clue necessarily about willpower versus no willpower, right? Because that can change over time. We assume that this has to be like resolved once and for all. But what we realize, if you pay attention to your life, you're directing and creating different things all the time, right? Including some kind of a philosophy or spirituality that never changes, that you're holding on to and you're weaponizing, right? You're weaponizing that to avoid seeing yourself as a creator in space and time, in part, as a finite perspective. So I feel like there are people who don't acknowledge the human or the finite perspective. They want to, in a way, destroy that for some reason that I never understood. I think it might be trauma, right? Like something happened to you that like hurt you really bad in the human, and now you really want to get beyond that, but you're doing kind of self-therapy in a way, right? But it's not going to work. It's just going to create a shadow problem. So from a wisdom perspective, you have to realize that groupthink has a standard of agreement. This standard of agreement is something that you're creating a relation to as a director in your own life. And you just, as you develop more wisdom, you have to ask yourself, like, should I be in this play or not, right? Basically, you're asking yourself, should I be in this play or not? So that's a very high level of creativity and aesthetics. And even when you don't have that kind of a choice, to kind of accept what's happening as well. So it's a paradox between intent and acceptance. So the final thing I want to talk about here is practices. So I know a lot of you guys, you have all kinds of different regimens of what you think is important for spiritual practice. Some of you might read the Bible. Some of you might do psychedelics. Some of you might do yoga. Some of you might go sit by a brook in the forest. One of the things about practices is I would be very wary of groupthink practices. And even Shankara was very cautious about groupthink practices. And this is why he was very much against what we might call karma yoga, which is the yoga of action. And he thought that really it was only jnana yoga, which is the yoga of knowledge, that was important, right? But that was almost too much of a gloss. What I'll say about practices is do what you think resonates with you, ultimately. Whatever resonates with you, right? This is where you have to be kind of anti-groupthink in a certain perspective. But you got to have like sometimes you got to ping the group too, just to see what everybody else is doing. But ultimately, I wouldn't recommend any practices actually, right? I would just say be aware of spirituality and engage with that as you see fit. Okay, friends? Hopefully this is a good video. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.